There are places we enter believing they will protect us. Locked doors, clean bed sheets, the illusion of home wrapped in a stranger's house. The idea is simple. You pay for safety, for shelter, for a space that pretends to belong to you. Yet there are moments in which the walls begin to whisper a different truth. The sound of footsteps when no one is supposed to be inside. A door closing by itself, though the air is still. The realization that the comfort you thought you bought was only a mask, and something else was waiting behind it. Airbnb is a system built on trust. Strangers opening their homes. Guests stepping into unfamiliar spaces. Both sides believing nothing dark will happen. But what if that trust was misplaced? What if behind those walls something lived that did not belong to you? Something that wanted you afraid or broken or gone? There are stories hidden in ordinary rentals. Stories that seem too strange to be true. And yet they are. In every town there is at least one house that feels wrong. Its windows reflect light in a strange way. Or the furniture feels as if it was arranged for someone else's life, not yours. Sometimes you cannot explain the unease. It is just there, gnawing quietly in the back of your thoughts. A guest may shrug it off as imagination, until the unease turns to certainty, until the night deepens and something begins to move in the shadows. One woman described it this way. It felt like the house knew me, like it was learning my habits. Every time I moved from room to room, I could feel the walls listening. Another man recalled that during his stay, he would hear a scraping noise in the ceiling above the bed, as if something dragged itself inch by inch while he tried to sleep. A family staying for just one night fled without explanation. They left behind their luggage, their car keys, even their shoes by the door. No one knows what they saw. These are not ghost stories whispered by candlelight. They are not campfire tales told to frighten children. They are documented experiences, reported by people who simply wanted a place to sleep, a roof over their heads while traveling. And yet they found themselves caught in something else, something that did not end when they left. Because that is the most haunting truth of all. Fear does not vanish with the morning light. It lingers. It waits in the corners of memory. Some guests never check in again, not because they do not travel, but because they no longer trust the walls around them. Once you have heard footsteps in the empty hall, once you have stared into the mirror and seen something shift behind you, you cannot return to silence. Think of the last time you walked into a rented space, the key pressed into your hand, the casual smile of the host, the moment you crossed the threshold and breathed in the smell of someone else's life. Did you notice the little details? A door that did not fully close, though its frame looked solid. A window that faced a wall too close, making it impossible to see the sky. Or perhaps you ignored the faint scratching in the pipes, the way the air seemed too heavy in the hall. Most people forget these details. They go to bed, wake up, and move on with their travels. But others, the unlucky few, remember. They remember because something made sure they did. They remember because what they encountered inside those walls was not ordinary. It was not safe. It was not explainable. There is an unspoken rule in horror that the places we should trust the most, the places that feel like sanctuary, are the ones that betray us. A home is supposed to be a shield. A room you pay for is supposed to give you peace. But imagine lying awake at night listening to the sound of someone unlocking your door, though you know you locked it yourself. Imagine waking to the sensation of being watched, your body stiff with the knowledge that you are not alone. Imagine realizing that the safety you purchased was an illusion, and what waited for you inside was older, hungrier, and far more deliberate. These stories are real. They are not legends passed from mouth to mouth until details blur. They were reported, investigated, whispered about by those who survived. 3 cases in particular stand out, each more unsettling than the last. In each, ordinary people checked into a place they believed would hold nothing more than silence and rest. What they found instead was something that changed them forever. This is not about superstition. It is about what happens when we step blindly into the unknown, when the comfort of 4 walls becomes the stage for something darker. These are the disturbing truths buried in ordinary rentals, waiting for the next guest to unlock the door. And so the question lingers. When you walk into a stranger's home, close the door behind you and turn the key. Are you locking the world out, or are you locking yourself in? The story begins in an unremarkable town, the kind of place people pass through without noticing. It was neither a destination nor a landmark, but simply a dot on a map between larger cities. Its streets were quiet, its houses lined in familiar patterns, and its nights fell heavy with the stillness of routine. The rental in question was a small house on the edge of the community, advertised as peaceful, private, and ideal for travelers who wanted quiet. There was nothing in the listing that suggested danger. The photos showed a clean front porch, a narrow hallway, a bedroom with folded blankets at the end of the bed. It looked ordinary, safe, forgettable. The guest who booked it was traveling for work. They were not searching for adventure, nor did they seek charm or luxury. All they wanted was silence, a place to sleep before moving on to the next city. Their journey had already been long, highways that stretched endlessly, motel signs that flickered half dead, the weariness of being anonymous in unfamiliar places. The decision to book this particular house was not special. It was chosen because it was available, because the host responded quickly, and because the photos promised nothing unusual. Sometimes it is the most ordinary choices that lead to the most unforgettable consequences. The town itself had a quiet history, but like all towns, whispers of unease lived beneath its surface. There were rumors of strange disappearances decades earlier, stories that older residents spoke of with lowered voices. A man who walked out of his home one winter night and never returned. A family that vanished from the outskirts, leaving behind their belongings as if they had stepped away for only a moment. These were the kinds of stories locals dismissed as accidents, tragedies, or unsolved mysteries, but they gave the town a shadow. Outsiders never knew these details because such shadows are rarely written down. They exist only in the pauses of conversations, the quiet stares of neighbors when certain houses are mentioned. The property itself had stood for years. Records showed that it had changed hands more often than most homes in the area. Owners came and went, sometimes selling within months. One couple abandoned it entirely, leaving furniture behind. Another lived there only long enough to repaint the walls before moving away without explanation. No official document ever described anything unusual, but the pattern was clear. Some houses do not want to be homes. They resist permanence. They carry something that repels those who stay too long. For the guest, however, these patterns were invisible. All they saw was a booking confirmation and a key in a lockbox. The host's message had been polite, almost distant. "Welcome, the house is yours, make yourself comfortable." There was no greeting in person, no face to attach to the space. This too seemed ordinary. Many guests preferred not to meet their hosts, and many hosts preferred the same. It allowed both sides to maintain distance, to keep the exchange purely transactional. But distance can also allow silence to grow, and silence has a way of holding secrets. The first impression of the house was simple. It was quiet, colder inside than expected, the kind of cold that lingers in old walls. The air carried the faint smell of dust, as though the windows had not been opened in some time. The furniture was plain, functional, unremarkable. And yet even in that ordinariness there was something faintly unsettling. The artwork on the wall seemed slightly crooked, the patterns of the wallpaper uneven, as though the house had been dressed quickly, carelessly, without real care for comfort. It gave the impression of a place meant to appear livable, but not lived in. The neighbors did not speak. On the first evening, the guest noticed an older woman across the street standing by her window watching. When their eyes met, she turned away abruptly, pulling the curtain closed. It was a small gesture, easily dismissed, yet it carried weight. It suggested she had seen too many people enter that house before, and perhaps she knew they would not stay. Every small detail seemed explainable. The uneven floorboards, old construction. The faint draft through the cracks, poor insulation. The silence that felt too heavy, merely the absence of city noise. And yet, when woven together, these details built an atmosphere of unease that was difficult to ignore. There was another piece of history tied to the property, one that rarely surfaced in conversation. Decades earlier, the house had belonged to a man whose name was eventually erased from local memory. Police records hinted at disturbances, noise complaints, and reports of strangers visiting at night. The man left abruptly, abandoning his possessions. Some said he had been driven out, others that he had been taken away. What remained certain was that after he left, the house never truly held another family. It only ever hosted short-term, temporary, fleeting, as if permanence was forbidden. The guest, of course, did not know this. All they knew was that they had arrived in a small town, opened the door, and stepped into a place that seemed designed to keep its secrets hidden. They set their bag down, took a breath, and told themselves it was just another night. Just another rental. But history does not rest easily. Houses that collect stories hold on to them layer upon layer, until the air becomes heavy with what has been left behind. The ordinary details of that house were not ordinary at all. They were the weight of decades, the residue of those who came before and did not linger. This was the context of the first disturbing stay. A guest arriving without suspicion, stepping into a house that had been waiting for them long before they chose it. A house that had already rejected others and would soon make its rejection clear again. The first night inside the house began without incident. The guest placed their belongings neatly in the corner of the bedroom, set their phone to charge, and lay down to rest after a long day on the road. For several hours there was only silence, the kind that weighed heavy but seemed harmless enough. The air was colder than expected, and the mattress felt stiff, but exhaustion carried them quickly toward sleep. Nothing unusual appeared to stir within those walls. But houses with long histories rarely reveal themselves at once. They wait, they measure, and when the time feels right, they begin to speak. It was close to midnight when the first sound came. A soft click, sharp in the stillness like the gentle shift of a door latch. The guest opened their eyes in the darkness, convinced it was the sound of the front door. But the key had locked it, they had checked twice. Still the noise lingered, not once but twice more. A pause, another click, then silence. They told themselves it was only the old frame shifting, perhaps the draft causing wood to expand. They lay still, listening, waiting for the sound again. Nothing followed. The house returned to silence, but the silence now carried weight, as if it were listening back. The next morning, light filtered faintly through the curtains. The guest moved through the house slowly, their steps echoing more than expected on the floorboards. In the kitchen, the air felt slightly damp, colder than the rest of the house. A drawer had been left open by a fraction, though they were certain they had closed it the night before. It was such a small thing, so easy to dismiss, yet it brought a sharp unease. It suggested presence. Someone or something had touched it. By afternoon, the house had grown quieter still, so quiet that even the sound of the guest's own breathing felt intrusive. They stepped outside for a walk through the neighborhood, and once again noticed the old woman across the street. She was standing at her window, unmoving, staring toward the house. When the guest lifted their hand in a polite gesture, the curtain slid shut without hesitation. It was as if the house itself had marked them, and the neighbors knew better than to engage. That evening, as the guest prepared for another night, they found the air in the bedroom heavier than before. The faint smell of damp earth seemed to seep from the floorboards, a scent that had not been there earlier. The bed, neatly made in the morning, now looked slightly disturbed, as though someone had sat upon it in their absence. They stood in the doorway, staring at the faint indentation, searching their memory to be sure they had not left it that way. Slowly, deliberately, they smoothed the sheets again, though the motion did nothing to ease their unease. As darkness returned, the sounds began again. Not clicks this time, but faint dragging. A scrape against the ceiling above the bed, as though something heavy was shifting. The guest froze, staring upward, their heart pressing against their chest. The sound was not continuous. It came in short bursts. Drag, pause, drag again, as if something moved with purpose. They whispered to themselves that it must be pipes or rodents, some ordinary explanation. Yet the heaviness in the air told a different story. When the sound finally stopped, silence once again grew too deep, too deliberate, as though the house was holding its breath. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by the faintest of noises. A floorboard creaking in the hallway, a soft, almost inaudible shuffle beyond the door. Each time the guest lifted their head, there was only stillness, but the stillness did not comfort. It pressed closer, thicker, until even closing their eyes felt unsafe. By morning, exhaustion left them pale and unsettled. They searched the house again, checking every lock, every window, as though proof of intrusion would make the unease more manageable, but nothing revealed itself. The locks remained secure, the windows remained shut, and yet the feeling of intrusion persisted. The second night, the unease sharpened into something heavier. Around midnight, the sound of movement came again, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. The guest heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, each one placed as if measured. They sat up in bed, staring at the thin line of light beneath the door. For a moment, the footsteps stopped just outside. Silence stretched so long it felt unbearable. Then faintly the sound shifted away, moving down the hall, fading into distance. The guests did not move. They did not breathe. They waited until the house settled once more, but sleep never returned. By the third day, the patterns had begun to form. Small disturbances that could no longer be dismissed as accidents. The faint indentation in the bed returned, deeper this time, as though something had rested heavily upon it. A glass the guest had left in the sink was found on the counter instead. The bathroom mirror, clean on arrival, now bore faint smudges across its surface as if a hand had pressed against it. Each sign was subtle, never dramatic, but each one made it harder to believe in ordinary explanations. The guest began to feel watched. In every room their movements seemed shadowed, followed by something unseen. In the reflection of the window, shapes seemed to shift in the background, though turning revealed only emptiness. Their skin prickled with the sensation of being observed. Every noise, every silence, every shadow held weight. That night, as they sat on the bed, phone in hand, considering whether to leave, the electricity flickered. The lamp beside them dimmed, then flared, then went dark. In the silence that followed, they heard it again, the sound of a latch, the unmistakable click of a door opening. This time it was not faint. It was deliberate. They held their breath, frozen, waiting for what would come next, but nothing came. The house fell silent once again, as if mocking their fear. And yet deep inside they understood. Something inside that house had noticed them. Something inside had begun to move closer. By the fourth day, the guest had lost any sense of rest. Sleep came in fragments, broken by noises that did not belong in the house. Their mind searched desperately for order, for logic, for anything that could explain what they had witnessed. Fear sharpens awareness, and awareness brings attention to details that others might overlook. They began to notice the house itself more closely, not just as a space to occupy, but as something to be studied, almost interrogated. And what they found did not align with what was expected. The first discovery was simple: the locks. Every evening, before trying to sleep, the guest checked each door twice, sometimes 3 times. The front door was old, but the deadbolt worked firmly. The back door had 2 locks, both secure, and yet each morning, one of the locks seemed slightly different. Not open, not broken, just positioned at a different angle, as if tested or manipulated during the night. The guests tried to convince themselves it was error, fatigue, distraction, memory playing tricks. But on the 3rd morning they photographed the bolt, just to be certain. By dawn, when they compared the images, the lock had shifted again. The second discovery was inside the bedroom. Beneath the rug at the foot of the bed, the floorboards were uneven. A slight bulge pressed upward from below, as though something rested beneath. With hesitant hands, the guest pulled back the rug and found the wood had been pried open before, the nails bent and loose, as though the boards had been lifted repeatedly. Beneath the gap was only darkness, the hollow space of a crawl area. The air that drifted from it was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of soil. The guest knelt there staring, waiting for movement in the blackness. None came, but the emptiness did not comfort. It only suggested something had been there once and might return. The mirror in the bathroom continued to disturb them. Each morning, new smudges appeared on its surface. At first faint, like the press of fingertips, then later broader, as though a hand had dragged downward in a slow, deliberate motion. The guest wiped the glass clean with a towel, only to find the marks returned by nightfall. There was no reason for this. No one else entered the bathroom. The smudges appeared while the guests slept. They began to feel as though the house was not simply occupied by something unseen, but that it was interacting with them directly, acknowledging their presence. On the 5th night, a storm rolled through the town, wind howling against the walls, rain hammering the windows. The sounds of weather masked the familiar creaks and clicks. For the first time in days, the guests allowed themselves to believe the house might stay quiet. But storms often reveal what silence hides. Around midnight, during a break in the thunder, the guest heard a new sound. Not the dragging from above, not the latch of doors, but a low humming. At first it was so faint it seemed part of the wind, but as they strained to listen, it became clearer. It was a voice. A human voice, steady and low, speaking in tones too muffled to form words. It came from the direction of the crawl space. The guests pressed their ear to the floor, their heart pounding in dread. The humming continued for several moments, then stopped abruptly, as if aware it had been overheard. When silence returned, it was deeper than before, charged with the knowledge of something concealed. They did not sleep again that night. Instead, they sat upright on the bed watching the dark hallway, listening for any movement until the storm faded and daylight returned. By this point, fear had shifted into obsession. The guest began documenting each incident, notes written on their phone, times recorded when noises occurred, photos taken of disturbed objects. They imagined that evidence might help them prove to themselves later that they had not imagined these events. But the more they documented, the less sense it made. The patterns had no rhythm, no logic, no source. Each disturbance felt both deliberate and chaotic, as though guided by intention but without explanation. Searching online brought little comfort. Reports from other travelers described similar experiences in homes across the country. Doors opening, mirrors marked, objects moved without reason. Some spoke of hidden cameras disguised in alarm clocks or smoke detectors, discovered only after days of feeling watched. Others described entire nights spent awake listening to footsteps, never finding proof of another presence. The guest read these accounts with dread, realizing their own story was not unique. It was part of something larger, an undercurrent of unease running beneath the promise of safety in strangers' homes. Police reports offered no clarity. In rare cases where guests fled properties and filed complaints, investigations found nothing substantial. Locked doors showed no signs of forced entry. Crawl spaces contained only dust and debris. Electrical systems explained flickering lights. The official explanations reduced terror to coincidence, fear to imagination. And yet, the guests who lived those nights never accepted the simplicity of those answers. Fear has a way of refusing to be rationalized. It clings, it insists, it remembers. The guest considered leaving, but leaving felt like defeat. They told themselves they would last until the end of their booking, that they could endure a few more nights. Perhaps they feared admitting to others that they were afraid. Perhaps they believed documenting the truth required them to remain. Whatever the reason, they stayed. But the house had already made its decision. It had already begun to move closer to make its presence undeniable. The final discovery came by accident. While searching for an outlet to charge their phone, the guest moved the small dresser in the corner of the bedroom. Behind it, hidden by the furniture, was a vent. Not a normal vent, but a wide rectangular opening, its cover loosely attached. When they knelt and peered inside, they saw not ducts or machinery, but empty space, a narrow passage leading deep into darkness. The air from within was colder than the rest of the room, carrying the faintest echo of something shifting further inside. The vent was not listed in the house's description. It was not mentioned in any report. And yet it was there, waiting as if the house had wanted them to find it. At that moment, the guest understood something with terrifying clarity. This was not coincidence. The noises, the marks, the shifts, they were not accidents. The house was not silent. It had been communicating all along, and what lived inside those walls was not finished. Fear, when sustained long enough, does not remain fear. It changes shape, bleeding into the fabric of daily life, dissolving the boundary between what is real and what is imagined. By the 6th day in the rental, the guest no longer experienced ordinary fear. What they carried now was something heavier, something corrosive that gnawed at the edges of thought. Sleep deprivation had hollowed their face, dark circles sinking beneath the eyes. Every small sound, whether a shifting board, the rattle of pipes, or the brushing of leaves outside, struck them with the weight of catastrophe. It was no longer possible to separate the ordinary from the unnatural. Everything felt dangerous. The body reacts first. Muscles tightened with each step as if preparing for impact. Their chest felt permanently constricted, breath shallow, rhythm uneven. Food had no taste. Hunger did not reach them. Even water felt difficult to swallow, caught in the tension of a throat that refused to relax. They had begun to sweat without reason, hands clammy even in the cold. When they glanced at themselves in the mirror, the reflection seemed foreign, as if the face they wore was already becoming something altered by the house. The smudges on the glass only worsened the impression, dragging the image down with invisible hands. But it was the mind that suffered most. Memories grew fragmented, unreliable. They questioned themselves constantly. Had the lock really shifted? Had the glass truly moved from sink to counter? Or had exhaustion twisted their perception? Doubt is the cruelest effect of fear. It isolates. It convinces the victim that the horror is not in the world, but in their own thoughts. This belief can destroy a person long before anything physical touches them. And the guest trapped within those walls began to accept that possibility, that perhaps they were losing their grip on reality, that perhaps no one would believe them. When they finally spoke with a colleague on the phone, their voice betrayed the strain. Words came out clipped, rushed, uncertain. They described the sleepless nights, the noises, the disturbances. The colleague listened politely, suggesting stress, overwork, the natural anxiety of constant travel. The guest hung up with the hollow realization that their fear was invisible to others. What felt life-threatening to them appeared trivial to those outside. This loneliness deepened the wound, pressing them further into silence. The paranoia spread. Even leaving the house no longer brought relief. As they walked through the small town, their senses remained heightened, searching for threat. The old woman across the street still lingered at her window, her expression unreadable. Every passerby seemed to look too long, as if aware of the house's secret. The guest no longer felt like a visitor, they felt marked, branded by their stay, carrying something others recognized. And when they returned each evening, inserting the key with a trembling hand, the door always seemed to close with a finality that promised no escape. Inside, they began to perform rituals, checking locks repeatedly, setting small objects in specific places to confirm if they shifted, taking photographs of the room before sleeping, hoping to compare them in the morning for proof of disturbance. These actions were meant to create control, but in truth they only deepened the obsession. Each morning brought contradictions, and each contradiction chipped away at the fragile structure of sanity. The psychological impact extended further into their perception of space itself. Corners of the house seemed darker than they should have been, as if light bent away from them. The hallway stretched unnaturally at night, appearing longer than it had during the day. Shadows moved subtly, not in grand gestures but in quiet shifts, enough to make the guest question their own eyes. The house was no longer static. It was fluid, breathing, reshaping itself around the mind of the person within. By the seventh night, the guest could no longer close their eyes. Each time they attempted to rest, the sound of footsteps returned, sometimes near, sometimes distant, but always measured. They sat upright in bed, staring at the doorway, convinced something would eventually enter. Their phone battery drained quickly as they kept the screen lit, unwilling to let the room fall into complete darkness. When the device finally died, the weight of isolation became unbearable. In that thick silence they heard breathing. Not their own. Slow, steady, coming from the vent hidden behind the dresser. The trauma of those nights did not end when the booking did. Long after leaving, the guest carried the house with them. They flinched at small noises in hotels. They refused to stay in rentals again, convinced that walls held memories, that some houses fed on human presence. Relationships with others grew strained, as they could not explain the intensity of their fear without sounding unhinged. Sleep never fully returned. Even years later, they woke suddenly in the night, convinced someone was standing in the hallway waiting. Experts who later examined their account suggested psychological explanations. Sleep deprivation can create hallucinations. Stress can amplify paranoia. The feeling of being watched is a common human response in unfamiliar environments. But none of these explanations erased the guest's certainty. None of them explained the smudges on the mirror, the humming in the crawl space, or the lock that shifted in silence. The emotional wound left by the experience was not simply fear of a place. It was the dismantling of trust. A house, any house, is supposed to shield those inside. When that promise breaks, the world itself feels altered. Nowhere feels safe. Doors do not promise protection. Silence does not promise peace. Every space becomes suspect. Every shadow holds potential. What is most disturbing is not what was heard or seen inside that rental, but what it took away. It did not just haunt the nights spent within its walls. It hollowed the very idea of home, leaving the guest unable to believe in safety again. This was the true cruelty of the house. It did not need to harm directly. It only needed to make the mind harm itself, slowly, relentlessly, until the person who entered was not the same as the one who left. When the guest finally left the house, their departure was quiet. They packed before dawn, refusing to linger, their body heavy with exhaustion but driven by an instinct that screamed to get away. They placed the key back into the lockbox with trembling hands and walked away without looking back. The house did not call them to return, but its weight remained inside them. Later, when their account spread among colleagues and eventually online, fragments of the story drew attention. And with attention came theories, each one attempting to explain what had happened inside those walls, yet none able to settle the unease. The first and most common theory was human intrusion. It suggested that the noises, the smudges, the shifting objects were the work of someone else who had access to the house. Hidden crawl spaces, vents, and unlocked doors are often used by criminals who inhabit homes without the knowledge of those who rent them. There are documented cases of strangers living secretly in walls, attics, and basements, emerging only at night to eat, move, and watch. If such a person had been inside that house, the guests' experiences could be explained. The footsteps, the dragging sounds, the sense of being watched, each could be traced back to an intruder who had made the space their own. The vent behind the dresser could have been their passage, the crawl space their hiding place. Yet the investigation revealed no evidence of such presence. When authorities were quietly informed, they entered the house, pulled open the boards, inspected the vent, and found nothing but dust. No footprints, no belongings, no signs of someone living inside. If there had been an intruder, they had erased themselves completely, leaving not even the faintest trace. Human presence leaves residue, fingerprints, fibers, scraps of life. Here there was nothing. The house was empty, and yet it had felt full. The second theory was psychological collapse. Sleep deprivation is known to twist reality. Those deprived of rest begin to hear sounds that do not exist, see figures in shadows, and doubt their own memory. The smudges on the mirror could have been their own handprints, unnoticed in exhaustion. The shifting of locks could have been lapses in memory. The voice beneath the floor could have been the brain fabricating sound in silence. Under this theory, the house itself was not haunted or inhabited by another, but instead served as the stage for the guest's own mind to betray them. What they feared was not outside but inside, manifesting as paranoia. But this explanation, while plausible, did not answer every detail. Psychological strain cannot move a glass from sink to counter. It cannot shift the lock of a door with mechanical precision. It cannot leave indentations in a bed when the body inside it has not moved. The mind is powerful, but the physical world resists imagination. Something beyond exhaustion seemed to leave its mark. The third theory was older, harder to hold in the light of reason, but impossible to ignore. It was whispered among the townspeople, hinted at by the old woman across the street who had watched silently from her window. Some houses, she said, are marked. They do not forget the violence or the despair that once occurred within them. They carry those memories, replaying them on whoever enters, not as ghosts in the traditional sense, but as imprints, patterns of unease that breathe through the walls. The dragging sound, the smudges on the mirror, the cold air from beneath the floor. These were not acts of a person, but of memory itself, replaying endlessly, refusing to fade. The house in this view was alive in a way that was not human. It had absorbed what had happened within, and it fed on those who dared to stay. This theory, dismissed as superstition by officials, explained why owners never lasted long, why families abandoned it, why neighbors avoided its presence. It also explained why each guest felt not only fear, but transformation. Houses like this do not merely frighten. They reshape. They draw the human mind into their rhythm, forcing it to bend to the patterns of dread that already exist within their walls. Whichever theory one chooses, the unease remains. If it was human intrusion, then it means someone had been inside, watching, waiting, capable of vanishing without leaving a trace. If it was psychological collapse, then it means the mind itself is the true enemy, capable of convincing someone that terror is real when it is not. If it was something older, something imprinted into the wood and walls, then it means some places are not meant to hold human life at all, because they already belong to something else. Investigators could not close the case because no crime had been committed. There was no theft, no injury, no trespassing proved. The report described the guest's account as unusual but unsubstantiated. The file was left open, then forgotten. The house, still standing, continued to appear online for short periods, sometimes rented again, sometimes vanishing from listings altogether. Each new tenant stayed briefly. Some left without comment. Others left reviews too vague to be useful. Words like strange atmosphere or not as comfortable as expected. No one ever described in detail what they had seen or heard. Perhaps they feared not being believed. Perhaps they feared acknowledging it out loud. Theories, after all, cannot erase memory. The guest who endured those nights still lives with the aftershocks. They avoid mirrors at night, refuse to enter crawl spaces, never again trust the quiet of empty houses. Their mind is a catalog of theories, none of which bring comfort. Theories explain, but they do not heal. They only add layers to the wound. The house remains silent, unbothered by speculation. It does not care if people believe it was intrusion, delusion, or haunting. It waits, as it has always waited, for the next key to turn in the lock. And so the question remains unanswered. Was the guest's terror born from within, from without, or from something no theory can ever touch? There are experiences that do not end when the door closes behind you. Some places follow. They do not cling in the obvious way like scars on the body, but in the quieter forms of memory that seep into every corner of daily life. The guest who left that house walked away carrying more than exhaustion. They carried the weight of knowing that shelter is not always protection, and that silence does not always mean peace. That knowledge lingers long after the walls are gone, because once you understand that safety can fracture without warning, no house ever feels the same again. The rental still stands. Its porch still faces the narrow street. Its windows still reflect light in ordinary patterns. From the outside, it is nothing more than another small house in an unremarkable town. Travelers drive past it without noticing. To the casual observer, it is just another listing, a temporary shelter offered for a modest fee. But inside, something remains. The walls, the floors, the air itself seem to hold on to those who have stayed, as if recording their presence, weaving it into a fabric of unease that only grows heavier with time. The story could be dismissed. Skeptics do not have to stretch far to explain it away. A tired traveler, sleepless nights, imagination filling in the gaps of silence. The mind is capable of cruelty when it is deprived of rest, but even the most rational explanation cannot erase what the guest remembers. They remember the sound of footsteps when no one else was there. They remember the lock that shifted without touch. They remember the low humming that rose from beneath the floorboards, a sound so deliberate it could not have been illusion. These are not fragments that fade. They are pieces of something that will not release its hold. Neighbors, too, carry their silence. The old woman across the street is still there, watching from her window, pulling the curtain closed whenever a new guest arrives. She does not speak of what she knows, but her eyes say enough. In her stillness is the weight of years of observation. She has seen the pattern repeat. Guests come and guests leave, and none stay long. Something about that house does not allow permanence. It rejects those who attempt to inhabit it, and it marks those who step inside. The most chilling element is not that the house frightens, but that it remains available. That someone at this very moment might be scrolling through listings, seeing photographs of a narrow hallway and a simple bedroom, believing they have found nothing more than an affordable stop along their travels. They will not know the stories. They will not know the patterns. They will only see what they want to see. A roof, a bed, a key that promises security. And perhaps in the first few hours they will feel comfortable enough to rest, until the sounds begin, until the silence deepens, until the house begins to notice them. Some believe such places are rare, that only a handful of houses across the world are marked in this way, carrying within them something more than history, something older, something without name. But the unsettling truth is that no one truly knows. With every rental comes the same illusion, that walls are safe, that strangers' homes can be borrowed without consequence. Each time the key turns in the lock, the guest chooses to trust. And sometimes that trust is betrayed. The guest never returned to the town, never passed through those streets again. But even now, they speak of the nights spent there in a voice stripped of warmth. They do not describe it with the wildness of superstition, nor with the exaggeration of legend. They speak plainly, coldly, as though recounting facts that cannot be bent. Their tone is what unsettles most. The absence of drama, the quiet certainty of someone who has lived through something and has no need to embellish it. Their fear is not in their words, but in the silence between them. The house does not care whether people believe or doubt. It does not care whether its story is retold or ignored. It waits, as it has always waited, for the sound of footsteps crossing its threshold, for the turn of a key in its lock, for the stillness of another human presence it can measure. And when that moment comes, it will do what it has always done. It will whisper. It will shift. It will reveal itself slowly until the mind inside bends beneath its weight. The reflection left behind is not one of horror alone, but of fragility. It forces the question, how many other houses scattered across small towns and quiet streets carry the same weight? How many guests leave behind not just keys but fragments of themselves, embedded in walls that do not forget? The uncertainty is the most terrifying element of all. It means the next booking confirmation, the next cheerful arrival, the next quiet night in a stranger's home could unfold into the same pattern. It means safety is only ever a story we tell ourselves until it is broken. And so the tale does not end with the guest's departure. It does not end with the lockbox clicking shut. It ends with a door waiting to be opened again, with silence pressing against the walls, with the lingering knowledge that once you have lived through such a night, you can never again trust the quiet of a rented room. The house waits still, and somewhere someone is about to step inside,